The phone rang at 2:17 in the morning. Ethan Harper had heard that ring 1,000 times over 19 years, mostly in dreams. He'd never once considered getting rid of the number. Friends told him to move on. His second wife, before their marriage ended, had asked him more than once why he still paid for a line nobody called. He never had a good answer. He just knew he wasn't ready to be the one who hung up first. He was 51 now. The apartment he lived in outside Burlington, Vermont, had a particular kind of quiet at that hour. The refrigerator cycling on, a neighbor's dog settling down 2 floors below, the sound of his own breathing once he was fully awake. He'd trained himself, over the years, not to jump at late calls. Most of them were nothing, a wrong number, a robocall about a car warranty he didn't own. He reached for the phone the way he always did, unhurried, half expecting disappointment. The screen read, "Private number." He answered on the 3rd ring, the way he always did, some old habit of not seeming too eager, even when there was no one left to seem calm for. For a few seconds, there was only breathing, slow, careful, the kind of breathing that sounds like someone deciding whether to speak at all. He almost hung up. His thumb was actually resting on the screen when the voice came. A woman's voice, calm and quiet, asked a single question. "Do you still have that white shell?" The line went dead before he could respond. Ethan told investigators later that he sat on the edge of his bed for almost 20 minutes without moving. Not because he didn't believe what he'd heard, because he did, immediately, completely, in a way that frightened him more than doubt would have. He said the strangest part wasn't the question itself. It was the calm behind it. No panic, no urgency, no fear in the voice at all. Just a woman asking about a shell, the way you'd ask someone if they remembered where they'd parked the car. To anyone else, it would have sounded like a prank or a wrong number or the kind of cruel joke that occasionally finds its way to families of the missing. And it does happen, more often than people realize, to families who've spent years with their loved one's face on a missing person's flyer. Detectives who work cold cases will tell you that hoax calls are almost a genre unto themselves. But Ethan wasn't anyone else, and the white shell wasn't something anyone else could have known about. Before we go further into what that call set in motion, I want to take a moment to thank those of you who've been with Archive 26 since our earlier cases, and welcome anyone joining us for the first time. If investigative stories like this one hold your attention, consider subscribing. It helps us keep reconstructing cases like this one. 19 years earlier, in August of 2005, Olivia Harper, 28 years old, married 6 days, stood on a rocky overlook on Mount Desert Island, Maine, watching the sun come up over Acadia National Park. She and Ethan had chosen the island for its quiet, small inns, coastal roads, hiking trails that emptied out before most tourists were awake. They'd talked about Maine on their second date, actually. Olivia had grown up going to a lake house in the Adirondacks every summer, and she'd told Ethan once, half joking, that she wanted a honeymoon that smelled like pine and salt water instead of a resort pool. They'd been staying at a small bed and breakfast called the Turns Watch Inn, a converted sea captain's house a short drive from the park entrance, run by a couple named Marjorie and Paul Voss. Marjorie remembered the Harpers well, even years later. She described them in a 2006 interview that was later filed with the case as the kind of newlyweds who still looked a little surprised to be holding hands, quiet, polite, the kind of guests who left their room key on the hook without being asked twice. On the 4th morning of the trip, Olivia woke before dawn and told Ethan she wanted to catch the sunrise from a lookout point, a short walk from their inn, a place called Cormorant Point, known locally for a granite ledge that faced due east over the water. She left the camera behind. She planned to be back within the hour, in time for the breakfast Marjorie served at 7, and took only a light jacket, the car key, and her phone. Ethan remembers rolling over in bed, half asleep, and telling her he'd catch up on coffee. It's a small, ordinary thing to remember, an unremarkable morning moment between two people who just started a marriage. And it has stayed with him for 19 years as the last conversation he ever had with his wife. Security footage from the inn's parking lot, recovered days later, showed her crossing the lot at 5:42 a.m., walking toward the trailhead with the easy, unhurried pace of someone expecting to be home before breakfast. The footage is grainy, time-stamped, ordinary in every way except for what it turned out to be. It was the last confirmed image of her that anyone has ever found. This story is a fictional narrative inspired by the kinds of cases investigators encounter, the human weight of a disappearance, the years a family carries it. Any resemblance to a real case is coincidental. It's told for entertainment and reflection, not as a factual account. By 7:15 that morning, Marjorie Voss had already set the breakfast table for the Harpers twice, once at 7, once again at 7:15, out of habit more than expectation. When Ethan came downstairs alone, unshaven, asking if she'd seen Olivia pass through, Marjorie didn't think much of it. Guests wondered. The island had a way of making people lose track of time. By 9, Ethan had walked the trail to Cormorant Point himself, twice, and found nothing but the granite ledge, empty, with the tide coming in below it the way it did every morning regardless of who was or wasn't there to see it. He called the local police at 9:40 a.m. The dispatcher who took the call, a woman named Carol Ann Pruitt, still remembers the particular pitch in his voice. "Not panicked exactly," she said years later. "More like a man trying very hard to sound like everything was still fine, because he hadn't let himself believe otherwise yet." Local police opened the search that same day. Within 48 hours, it had grown into one of the largest search operations the region had seen in years. Forest rangers combed the trail system in overlapping grids, working outward from Cormorant Point in a pattern that widened by a quarter mile every few hours. The Coast Guard checked the coastline in case she'd wandered toward the water. The tide at Cormorant Point runs strong enough, at certain hours, to pull a person under and carry them well past where any search boat would think to look. Search dogs worked the overlook and the surrounding woods, their handlers noting, almost as an aside in the official log, that the dogs picked up a clear scent trail leading to the granite ledge. And then nothing. No trail leading away. No trail leading back. As though the scent simply stopped. That detail unsettled the search coordinator more than almost anything else in the first 72 hours. Search dogs are trained to follow ground-level scent, and scent trails that vanish outright rather than fading gradually usually mean one of two things. The person entered a vehicle, or the person entered water. Divers checked the tide pools and inlets nearest the trailhead for 3 straight days. Search planes flew grid patterns over the forest canopy until fog rolled in on the 4th day and grounded them entirely. More than 300 volunteers, many of them strangers to the Harpers, walked the island in coordinated lines for 5 straight days. One of them was a lobsterman named Del Coombs, 63 years old at the time, who lived on the island his whole life and knew its coastline the way most people know their own kitchen. He joined the search on the 2nd morning, not because he knew the Harpers, but because, as he put it in an interview decades later, "You don't sit home when somebody's missing on your island. You just don't." Del walked the shoreline for 4 days, checking coves that weren't on any official map, places only a local would think to look. He remembers the specific cold of those mornings, fog sitting low over the water, the particular silence of 300 people searching in a kind of grim, unspoken coordination, nobody wanting to be the one who called out and found something. We didn't talk much out there, Dell said. You'd pass somebody on the rocks and just nod. Everybody was thinking the same thing and nobody wanted to say it out loud. They found nothing, no body, no sign of a fall, no torn clothing snagged on brush, no blood, no struggle. Her phone had stopped transmitting a signal within minutes of leaving the inn, not gradually fading, the way a dead battery does, but simply gone, as though it had been powered off or destroyed. There was no bank activity in the days that followed. No ransom demand ever came. A woman who vanishes from a national park trail usually leaves some trace, even a small one. Olivia left almost none. By the fourth day, Ethan had stopped sleeping in any real sense. Marjorie Voss remembers bringing him coffee at 4 a.m. and finding him already awake in the inn's front parlor, sitting with a map of the island spread across his knees, tracing the same section of coastline over and over with his finger, as though repetition might change what the paper showed him. He wasn't crying, she said. That was almost worse. He'd gone past crying into something quieter. There was one detail, buried in the interview transcripts, that nobody thought much of at the time. A tourist couple, a school teacher named Diane Kowalski and her husband visiting from Ohio, mentioned, almost as an afterthought during their police interview, that they'd seen Olivia the night before her disappearance, talking briefly with another woman inside a gas station a few miles from the inn. Diane recalled it clearly enough to describe the scene. Olivia standing near the coffee counter, the two women talking in a low, unhurried way that didn't look like strangers making small talk. It looked like they knew each other a little, Diane told police. Not close, maybe, but not like two people who'd just met either. The conversation looked ordinary, nothing urgent, nothing tense. The unfamiliar woman was never identified. She paid for a bottle of water in cash and left before Diane thought to get a good look at her face. Investigators at the time assumed she was just another traveler passing through, and with no name, no plate number, and no clear description beyond dark hair, maybe 35, there was nothing to chase. It's a small thing to have missed. But looking back, I wonder how many of us would have caught it either. A stranger's face in a gas station, gone before anyone thought to ask her name. By the fifth day, the search scaled down from an active rescue operation to what officials call carefully a recovery posture, a phrase that means, without quite saying it, that hope of finding someone alive has started to give way to the grimmer task of finding out what happened. Del Coombs remembers the exact moment the search coordinator announced it to the volunteers gathered at the trailhead. Nobody argued, he said, but nobody left either. We all just stood there a minute. The case stayed active for 2 years, then went quiet. By 2012, 7 years after Olivia walked out of frame, it was formally reclassified as a cold case. Every cold case has a name attached to it that outlasts the file's active years, usually a detective who never quite let it go, even after the department moved their attention elsewhere. For Olivia Harper's case, that name was Frank Delacroix. Delacroix caught the case in its second week, when it was clear the original search wasn't going to produce a body or a suspect. He was 34 at the time, a state police detective with a reputation for being methodical to the point of stubbornness. The kind of investigator who rereads a witness statement a dozen times, looking for the sentence that doesn't quite fit. He worked the Harper file for 6 years before it was formally downgraded, and even after his caseload moved on, he kept a personal copy of the file in a drawer in his home office. He retired in 2019. He kept the copy anyway. "You're not supposed to get attached to a case," Delacroix said, in an interview conducted after the file was reopened in 2024. "They train that out of you, or they try to." But there was something about this one, the gas station woman, the scent trail stopping dead at the overlook. It didn't sit right, and it never stopped not sitting right, even 15 years later. Delacroix remembered the moment in 2007 when he'd first floated the theory that Olivia might have left the island under her own power. Not a victim, but a woman who'd walked away from her own life. It was not a popular theory with Ethan, and Delacroix understood why. He raised it anyway because a good investigator has to consider every version of events, even the ones that hurt the people who loved the missing person. I sat Ethan down and told him I had to ask. Delacroix said, "Was there any trouble in the marriage? Any doubts? Any reason she might have wanted to disappear on her own terms?" He remembered Ethan's answer clearly, even years later, not angry, just exhausted. He said, "If she wanted to leave, all she had to do was tell me. She didn't need to vanish to do that." And for what it's worth, I believed him. Everything I found afterward backed that up. There was no affair, no debt, no secret life, just two people who'd been married 6 days. By 2009, Delacroix had ruled out every plausible version of an accident. The tide charts for that morning showed the water at Cormorant Point was calm, not the kind of surge that could sweep someone off the ledge without a trace. There was no medical history that suggested a fall from dizziness or fainting. The granite ledge itself, when examined by geologist Delacroix, brought in independently, showed no sign of a fresh break or slide. "An accident should leave a story behind," Delacroix said. "A scuff mark, a broken branch, something. This left nothing, and in my experience, nothing is its own kind of evidence." He also chased and eventually ruled out 3 other leads that never made it into the abbreviated version of the case most people know. A man with a prior record of harassment, living 40 minutes from the island, was investigated for 6 weeks in late 2005 before his alibi, confirmed by a hospital admission the same week, cleared him entirely. A rental car matching a partial plate description reported by a hiker turned out to belong to a family from Quebec, in Maine for an unrelated vacation, gone before investigators even reached them, and a hiker who'd reported a bad feeling about a man near the trailhead that morning turned out to be describing a park ranger who'd simply been doing a routine equipment check. "Most of the job is closing doors," Delacroix said. "You knock on 20 of them to find the one that matters. People think detective work is one big breakthrough. Mostly it's 100 small dead ends." By the time the case was formally reclassified as cold in 2012, Delacroix had personally interviewed 41 people. He believed and wrote in his closing summary that the gas station woman and the sudden end of the scent trail were connected, that Olivia had in some way he couldn't yet prove left that overlook by choice or by force with someone she may have already known. It was a theory nobody acted on for the next 12 years, because there was nothing left to act on it with. "I used to drive past the exit from Mount Desert Island sometimes," Delacroix said, "even after I moved off the case officially. I never had a reason to get off the highway. I just knew it was there." Cold cases don't stay in the news. They stay in the people who live them. Ethan moved back to his hometown in Vermont 2 years after the search ended, unable to stay in a place that still felt like it was holding its breath. He took a job managing a hardware store, the kind of steady, unremarkable work that let him get up in the morning without having to decide anything difficult. He remarried in 2011 to a woman named Carla, a nurse he'd met through a mutual friend. By his own later account, part of what ended that marriage 6 years later was something Carla described gently near the end as sharing a house with someone who was still waiting for a phone call. "I didn't understand it as a betrayal," Carla said in a brief statement she gave after the case reopened in 2024 when reporters found their way to her. "I understood it as grief that never got to finish. You can't compete with a question nobody's answered. I stopped trying." Ethan never disconnected Olivia's old line. He paid the bill every month without really examining why. The charge showing up on his statement between the electric bill and the gym membership he rarely used, a small, strange constant in an otherwise ordinary life. Detectives who worked the case in its early years eventually retired, Delacroix among them. New ones inherited a file that grew thinner with each passing anniversary, not thicker. There is a particular kind of moment that recurs in cases like this one. A moment that doesn't make it into official reports because it isn't evidence. It's just life continuing to happen around an absence. For Ethan, one of those moments came in October of 2015, 10 years after Olivia disappeared, when he found himself standing in the seasonal aisle of his own hardware store, restocking shelves of Halloween decorations, and realized he was crying without having noticed he'd started. A co-worker, a younger man named Jared who didn't know the full story, asked if he was all right. Ethan told him allergies. He went to the stockroom and sat on an overturned crate for 11 minutes before going back out to the floor. He told that story later to a grief counselor he saw briefly in 2018, one of the only times he sought any kind of formal support. The counselor, whose notes were later reviewed as part of the reopened investigation with Ethan's permission, wrote that he displayed what she called suspended grief, an inability to fully mourn because mourning implies an ending, and Ethan had never been given one. "Most of my clients grieving a death have a date," she wrote. "Mr. Harper has a mourning. It never became a date. It just kept being a mourning that wouldn't finish." By 2020, the case existed mostly as a folder in a records room and a name that came up once a year in a local news retrospective on unsolved Maine disappearances. A journalist named Renata Ibarra, who covered cold cases for a regional outlet, wrote a 15th anniversary piece on the disappearance in 2020, one of the few pieces of writing that kept Olivia's name from disappearing into the file entirely. Renata interviewed Ethan for that story and remembers him as a careful, guarded man who answered every question thoroughly and volunteered nothing extra. "He wasn't cold," Renata said. "He was just someone who'd learned that hope, handled carelessly, could hurt worse than certainty. He'd built a kind of wall around himself, not against the case, but against getting his hopes up again." I remember him saying, almost apologetically, "I've made peace with not knowing. I had to." I didn't fully believe him. I don't think he fully believed himself. Renata's article ran with a single photograph. Olivia at the Overlook, taken the morning before she disappeared. Camera left behind in the room, but a photo captured earlier in the trip by a fellow guest at the inn, later shared with the family. In it, Olivia is laughing at something out of frame, wind pulling her hair sideways, the ocean gray-blue behind her. It's the image that ran in every subsequent news story about the case. It's the image Ethan says he can no longer look at directly. By 2024, Ethan was 51, living alone, still in Vermont, still working at the hardware store, though he'd been promoted to manager by then. He rarely spoke about the case anymore, even to close friends. His mother, who had been his closest confidant through the early years, passed away in 2019, and with her went one of the last people who still asked him, gently every few months, anything new? Not expecting an answer, just making sure the question stayed alive somewhere. Then, in September of 2024, at 2:17 in the morning, a number Ethan hadn't heard from in 19 years rang once more. And this time, it wasn't a memory. It was real. Ethan called the Maine State Police the next morning, his hands shaking badly enough that he had to set the phone down twice before he could finish dialing. He remembers the dispatcher asking him to repeat himself, not because she hadn't heard him, he thinks now, but because what he was describing didn't fit the shape of a normal call. Within a week, the FBI's Boston field office had taken an interest, not because a phone call is unusual, but because of what the caller knew. The white shell had been a private joke between Olivia and Ethan during their honeymoon. Whichever of them found it first in their luggage was supposed to hide it again before the trip ended. A small, silly ritual neither of them had ever mentioned to family, friends, or police. It started on their second night at the Turns Watch Inn, when Ethan found the shell, smooth, ordinary, the kind you'd pick up on any New England beach, tucked into a sock in his suitcase. Olivia had slipped it in as a joke before they left for the trip, a tiny, private piece of mischief. Ethan hid it back in her toiletry bag the next morning. She found it 2 days later and hid it in his jacket pocket. It was, by Ethan's account, a game with no real rules and no real endpoint, just something two newlyweds did to make each other laugh in the small hours of a marriage that was, at that point, 6 days old. It never appeared in any interview transcript. It never appeared in the wedding album captions Ethan had posted years earlier. It was never mentioned to Marjorie Voss, to Frank Delacroix, to Renata Ibarra, to anyone. There was no way to have learned it, except from Olivia herself. Special Agent Priya Chandrasekaran, assigned to reopen the file in 2024, described the moment she first read Ethan's statement about the shell as the kind of detail that changes a case's entire posture in about 4 seconds. She had worked cold cases for 11 years and had fielded dozens of hoax calls tied to old files. People claiming to be missing persons, usually for attention, occasionally for cruelty. Almost none of them survived a basic verification check. This one did, Chandrasekaran said. Not just survived it, passed it in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. Telecom analysts began tracing the call's path and ran into a wall almost immediately. It had been routed through several international VoIP servers before reaching the US network, the kind of layered routing typically used to mask a caller's true location, the sort of technical sophistication that immediately raised the question of whether the caller had help or specific knowledge of how to stay hidden. For a while, investigators believed the origin would never be pinpointed. The FBI's initial technical report, filed 3 weeks into the reopened investigation, concluded flatly that the routing exceeds standard resolution capability without ISP-level cooperation from at least 4 separate jurisdictions. Then, a telecommunications specialist named Owen Marsh, working the file at the request of Chandrasekaran's team, noticed something the earlier searches had missed. Marsh had spent 15 years analyzing VoIP fraud for a private security firm before consulting for the FBI on a contract basis, and he had a particular fascination with routing configurations most analysts considered noise. He found a rare server configuration that matched a small cluster of other calls placed during an 8-minute window that same night. Calls that had nothing to do with the Hopper case on their face, but shared a technical fingerprint distinctive enough that Marsh was confident they'd originated from the same physical location, likely the same device. It's a little like finding a specific kind of static on a radio, Marsh explained. Once you know what you're listening for, you can pick it out of a lot of noise. The configuration itself isn't rare because it's sophisticated. It's rare because it's old. The kind of setup you'd see on hardware that hasn't been updated in a long time, in a place with limited infrastructure options. It wasn't enough to give an address, but it narrowed the likely origin to a small rural stretch of the Midwest, an area spanning parts of 2 states, dense with the kind of small towns that don't show up prominently on most maps. Meanwhile, an audio lab in Quantico stripped the recording of background interference, using techniques that hadn't existed in any usable form back in 2005. Underneath the woman's voice, 3 faint sounds emerged: the low rumble of a freight train passing, a church bell striking the half hour, and a bus station announcement. too distant and distorted to make out clearly beyond a handful of syllables. None of those sounds, on their own, meant much. A freight line, a church, a bus station, thousands of small American towns have all three. But together, cross-referenced against public recordings, rail schedules, and a database of church bell patterns that a forensic audio analyst named Delia Fournier had spent years building almost as a personal project, they began to shrink the search radius from a broad region to something closer to a handful of towns. Church bells aren't as generic as people think, Fournier said. The interval, the tone, whether it's a recording or an actual bell being struck, it's like a fingerprint if you have enough reference points. We got lucky that the caller happened to be somewhere with a church old enough to still ring by hand instead of an automated chime. Do you think a person who's been missing that long, if she really made that call, wanted to be found, or just needed once, to know the person on the other end still remembered her? With the call treated as credible evidence, a task force reopened the entire 2005 file and began rebuilding the Harper's honeymoon, hour by hour, using tools that hadn't existed in 2005. They pulled digitized hotel records, toll data, old rental car logs, tax filings from local businesses, and seasonal staffing lists from the park, records nobody had thought to cross-reference 2 decades earlier, many of them only recently digitized from paper archives that had sat in storage since the mid-2000s. The task force, led jointly by Chandrasekaran and a Maine State Police cold case unit formed specifically for the reopened file, spent 4 months on this phase alone before a single new lead emerged. The breakthrough, when it came, arrived almost by accident. A records technician named Priyanka Desai, cross-referencing old employment rosters from the National Park's seasonal staffing program, noticed a name that had been misfiled for 19 years, a temporary trail maintenance worker whose employment record had been entered under a slightly misspelled surname, which was why it had never surfaced in any earlier search of the database. That misfiled record led eventually to a woman named Rosalind Kepler, who had worked the trail maintenance program for exactly 1 season, the summer of 2005, and had never been interviewed at the time because her name simply didn't appear in the searchable records. Kepler had moved out of Maine in early 2006, and when investigators finally located her in 2024, was living in Nebraska. She agreed to speak with the task force by video call, and what she remembered, 19 years later, from a single overlapping shift, turned out to be one of the most significant pieces of testimony in the reopened case. I saw a woman matching the photo they later showed me, Kepler said in the recorded interview, later reviewed by Archive 26. Getting into a parked vehicle near the overlook, early, right around when I was setting out cones for the day's trail work. I didn't think anything of it at the time. People get picked up from trailheads all the time. Friends, family, shuttle services. What made Kepler's account significant wasn't just that she'd seen Olivia. It was how she described her. She didn't hesitate, Kepler said. She didn't look back toward the trail, the way you might if you were leaving somewhere you'd rather not have to. She got in on her own. It looked, and I want to be careful here, because it was 19 years ago, and I'm not trying to overstate what I remember. But it looked the way you'd get into a car with someone you already knew. Comfortable, not rushed, not scared, just normal. Chandrasekaran, reviewing Kepler's statement alongside the original 2005 case file, noted that this account didn't contradict anything Delacroix had found. It confirmed a theory he'd raised in 2007 and never been able to substantiate. Delacroix's instincts were right 19 years before we had the evidence to back them up, Chandrasekaran said. That happens more than people think. Sometimes the case just has to wait for the right piece of technology or the right witness to finally get found. Separately, A modern forensic re-examination of a jacket recovered near the search area in 2005, long dismissed as unrelated debris, catalogued and stored in an evidence locker for 19 years without a second look, turned up synthetic fibers that didn't match anything the Harpers owned. Lab comparisons, run using fiber analysis technology that didn't exist in any accessible form in 2005, linked the fibers to the interior lining used in a specific line of commercial vans sold in the mid-2000s, a detail that would have been essentially unprovable at the time of the original investigation. Cross-referenced against archived toll camera footage from 2 different points near the inn, footage that Maine's transportation department had remarkably preserved in a long-term digital archive rather than purging after the standard retention period. Investigators also identified a white van, unregistered to any local business operating in the area at the time, passing through the area twice within the relevant window. Once the night before Olivia disappeared, once the morning of. The van's plate was too degraded in the archived footage to read cleanly, but a forensic imaging specialist was able to narrow it to a partial sequence, enough to cross-reference against period vehicle registration records from 3 neighboring states. It did not, on its own, produce a name. It did narrow a 19-year-old blank space down to a specific, searchable range of possibilities. The kind of progress that, in cold case work, can take years to achieve and sometimes never comes at all. A cash purchase. Olivia made at a convenience store hours before she vanished. Previously just a footnote, noted in the original file only because her card wasn't used, and investigators wanted to establish she'd had cash on hand. Took on new weight next to a discarded, unidentified receipt found near the trailhead during the original search. One that had sat in an evidence box for 19 years because nothing about it seemed relevant at the time. When re-examined in 2024, the receipt's faded print was recovered using infrared imaging, revealing a purchase from a hardware store roughly 90 kilometers inland. Rope, a roll of tarp, and a flashlight. Purchased the same week Olivia disappeared. Paid for in cash. And an incomplete guest log from a motel nearly 90 kilometers away. The same general distance as the hardware store purchase. A detail that did not go unnoticed by the task force. Showed a room paid for in cash that same week, registered under a name that, when investigators checked in 2024, turned out not to exist in any public record before or since. No single piece of it proved anything. But laid side by side for the first time in 19 years, they stopped looking like scattered debris and started looking like a route. A route someone had taken deliberately, provisioned for, and paid for in a way specifically designed to leave nothing behind. By early 2025, the investigation had 2 threads running in parallel. The physical evidence, slowly rebuilding a 2005 route that led inland from Mount Desert Island, and the 2024 phone call, which Owen Marsh and Delia Fournier were still working to narrow further. It was Marsh who made the next connection, 3 months after his first breakthrough on the server configuration. Working methodically through the cluster of calls that shared the same technical fingerprint as the call to Ethan, Marsh found that the same device appeared to have placed 6 other calls over an 18-month period between 2023 and 2024, none of them, on the surface, connected to any known case. Most had gone unanswered or been dismissed by their recipients as spam. One recipient, a woman in Ohio, had kept a voicemail from an unknown caller for over a year without knowing why. When Chandrasekaran's team reached her, the woman played the message for them over the phone. It was under 10 seconds long. A woman's voice, hesitant, asking if Danny still lived at an address the caller then read aloud, before hanging up. The recipient had no idea who Danny was, and had simply never deleted the message, assuming it might eventually make sense. Cross-referenced against the audio fingerprint from Ethan's call, and against Fournier's church bell database, The voicemail placed the same caller in the same rural stretch of the Midwest, on a date 11 months before the call to Ethan. It was the first piece of evidence suggesting the caller had made contact with more than one person from what appeared to be a life she'd left behind. Not just Ethan, but possibly others. In a pattern investigators were only beginning to understand. That was the moment the case stopped feeling like a single phone call and started feeling like a pattern. Chandrasekaran said, "A woman trying, in small, careful ways, over more than a year, to reconnect with pieces of a life she'd been separated from. Whether by choice or by force, we still didn't know. But it was no longer one impulsive call in the middle of the night. It was something she'd apparently been doing, quietly for a while." Marsh, working alongside Fournier, eventually narrowed the likely town of origin to a cluster of 3 small communities in a rural county, based on the combined weight of the server configuration, the freight schedule, and the church bell pattern, which Fournier was able to match to a specific parish after months of comparison work. "I won't pretend it was fast," Fournier said. "It took a long time, and a lot of it was ruling things out rather than ruling things in. But by the winter of 2025, we had it down to a search radius small enough that a physical presence on the ground made sense for the first time." In early 2025, Maine State Police officially changed the classification of Olivia Harper's case from a probable accident on a national park trail to a disappearance involving unknown third parties. It was a quiet administrative change, a few lines in a database. But for a file that had sat untouched for the better part of 2 decades, it meant something had finally shifted from assumption to evidence, a shift that Frank Delacroix reached for comment after the reclassification, described simply as 18 years overdue and worth every bit of the wait. Federal agents, working with the task force, later executed search warrants at 2 properties within the narrowed search radius, identified by Marsh and Fournier's audio analysis, though the results remained sealed pending further review. Chandrasekaran would say only that the searches were consistent with the investigative direction the evidence had been pointing toward. A careful, procedural phrase that nonetheless represented for Ethan the first tangible action taken on his wife's case in 19 years. Ethan was not present for the searches. He learned about them the same way he'd learned almost everything else in the reopened investigation. A phone call from Chandrasekaran, this one expected, this one from a number he recognized. He has said, in the only public statement he's given since the case reopened, that he no longer lets himself imagine a specific outcome. "I spent 19 years imagining the worst, because it felt safer than hoping," he said. "I'm not going to start imagining the best now, not until someone shows me something I can hold on to. But for the first time, I believe someone is looking. That's not nothing. After 19 years, that's not nothing at all." The identity of the woman who called Ethan Harper at 2:17 in the morning has never been officially confirmed. What has changed is the question investigators are now willing to ask out loud, one nobody dared raise for 19 years. That Olivia Harper may not have disappeared the way everyone assumed on that quiet August morning in 2005. That somewhere, she may still be the one holding the other half of a joke only 2 people ever knew. Del Coombs, the lobster man who walked the shoreline for 4 days in 2005, still lives on Mount Desert Island. He says he thinks about that search sometimes, usually in August, when the tourists come back and the overlook fills up again with people taking photographs of a sunrise that, for one family, has never quite finished happening. "I hope she's out there," he said. "I hope she made that call because she wanted to be found, not because she couldn't help herself. That's the part I think about, not whether she's alive, whether she's finally ready to come home." Before we close, a reminder. This has been a fictional story, inspired by the real emotional weight that cases like this carry for the families who live them. not an account of an actual person or event. It's offered for entertainment and reflection. If this case stayed with you the way it stayed with us to put together, we'd genuinely like to know what you think happened to Olivia. Let us know in the comments. And if investigative stories like this one are your thing, consider liking the video and subscribing to Archive 26 for more. Thank you for spending this time with us.